Welcome back to the Gridiron Expert. Week 2 of college football is already upon us, and as always, we are going to break down the biggest games of the week. So right now we have our 6 biggest games of Week 2 up here on the board, but when I went through the schedule, I found 11 games that could technically be considered big games or important games. Games certainly worth watching. So some games that just missed the cut that I didn't consider the biggest of the week but are still going to impact conference play, and games that people should watch are Arizona at Houston. That game because Kevin Sumlin and Khalil Tate got off to a horrible start in Week 1, losing to BYU 28-23. Tate, many who consider to be a potential Heisman contender, did not have a very good performance. So we have to start thinking, are the defenses slowly starting to figure out that style of play? Are they going to be able to shut him down and pretty much make him irrelevant in conference play and over the course of this season? So they really need this win against a solid Houston team to avoid an 0-2 start. Now, yes, if they were to lose this, both those games were in non-conference play, so it's not going to hurt their chance for a Pac-12 championship appearance like I predicted, but you definitely need to get a win over a solid Houston team, especially one led by Ed Oliver on defense, one of probably the best defensive end in the entire nation. So we need to take a look at that game. You got Colorado at Nebraska, also just missing the cut. This game important because Nebraska's game got canceled in Week 1. This is going to be the debut of Scott Frost. They didn't get to have that tune-up game in Week 1, so their first game is against a Colorado team that had a very good performance against Colorado State. Obviously not the best of opponents, but this is still a solid team, a solid Pac-12 team that they're going to open up the season with. And then, of course, as always, Scott Frost debut, so that's something to keep your eye on there. Iowa State at Iowa. Iowa State, like Nebraska, getting their first game canceled, so I know a lot of people are wanting Iowa State, Nebraska to make up that lost game in December, so hopefully that will happen, but I extremely doubt it. But this game important because it's a rivalry game. It's always fun to watch, usually a very competitive game. Iowa State certainly on the rise, has the offense to compete against Iowa this season, so I'm very curious to see how this one goes. So that's one you need to keep an eye on there. Kentucky at number 25, Florida. I think it's been 31 or 32 straight games that Florida has beaten Kentucky, so this game should always be on the list until that streak is snapped. And so we're going to have to see how Kentucky comes out and plays here. But this Florida team is different. This is led by Dan Mullen. The offense is different, something that we didn't see under Jim McElwain, and it is at the Swamp. I just don't see Kentucky going on the road and beating Florida this season. I expect that streak to continue, but certainly a game worth watching and keeping your eye on, just in case Kentucky goes in there and pulls off the huge upset. And then our last one, number 15, Michigan State at Arizona State. This is just an intriguing game because Michigan State had a horrible start to the season, nearly losing to Utah State in the opener. I believe winning that game 38-31. Game coming down to about the final minute where they had to get a game-winning interception. Arizona State, led by Herm Edwards. Both these teams, I think, have very solid offenses, so I can see this game being high-scoring out in the desert. They had a solid opener, but it was against not a very good opponent, I think, in Texas San Antonio. So we're going to have to see how this game goes. I expect Michigan State to still get the win, but this is certainly a game worth watching, a very intriguing game. It would not surprise me to see Herm Edwards have his team hyped and to come out and get a win in this one. So those are those 5 games that just didn't make the cut, but certainly are going to be some of the bigger games of Week 2. Now, here are the 6 games that I think are the biggest games of Week 2. And we'll start up here with number 18, Mississippi State at Kansas State. And this game is big because Nick Fitzgerald is going to make his debut for Mississippi State. He got suspended for the first game. Joe Moorhead making that decision to suspend him against the game. I think it was against Stephen F. Austin. And they're going on the road to play Kansas State. A Kansas State team just barely survived South Dakota, winning 27-24. So not a very impressive performance by Bill Snyder and his Wildcats. But as to be expected, Week 1 is always where you're trying to work out things and try to figure out what's going to work for your team and what's not. So you're not expected to get your best performance out of your team in Week 1. But this is always a big deal whenever you have a 2 Power 5 teams going at it, SEC and Big 12. Anytime you play another Power 5 opponent that's not in your conference, it's a big deal. This game bigger for Kansas State to get a solid win over a ranked SEC opponent. Last year they went on the road as a ranked team and lost to Vanderbilt. I still think Mississippi State gets the win here. I think their offense is going to be too much. And if Kansas State hasn't changed anything or hasn't improved a little bit from that horrible performance against South Dakota, Mississippi State should cruise in this one. You know Nick Fitzgerald's going to come out hungry to get a win, especially since he didn't get to play last week. And you got UCLA at number 6, Oklahoma, and this game would be a lot more intriguing had UCLA beaten Cincinnati in Week 1. That was a horrible debut for Chip Kelly as well. I didn't expect that to happen. I know other people didn't expect that to happen, but you gotta question how this season's going to go for Chip Kelly and the Bruins this year. I had them going 3-9. And it's extremely possible that could happen because the performance against Cincinnati does not make me believe they can go on the road and beat Oklahoma. It doesn't make me believe they can compete in the Pac-12 this season against the likes of a USC or a Stanford or Oregon, somebody like that. Oklahoma, on the other hand, looked like they didn't even skip a beat, miss a beat after losing Baker Mayfield. Kyler Murray filled in as quarterback, had a great performance against Florida Atlantic. Some people had them as a potential dark horse to upset the Sooners in the season opener. They just annihilated Lane Kiffin and his Owls team. I expect the same thing to happen this week. I do not see any scenario where UCLA goes on the road and upsets Oklahoma this week. I think Kyler Murray is going to have another big year, another big game, and they get a win over a Bruins team that might be struggling in Chip Kelly's first year. And then this is probably the biggest game, in my opinion, of the week. I know College Game Day is going to number 2 Clemson and Texas A&M, but number 3 Georgia and number 24 South Carolina. This game is important because it's potentially could decide who wins the SEC East. Now, I truly believe that South Carolina is the biggest competitor to Georgia in the SEC East. I know some people could say Florida. I know some people could say Missouri, but I think really it's the Gamecocks and Will Muschamp that are going to compete against Georgia. And what better way to kind of distinguish who's going to be real in Week 2 at Williams-Brice Stadium. I'm picking the Gamecocks in this one. I picked the Gamecocks back in the summer. I'm sticking with that pick now. Like I said, I knew they were going to slip into the top 25. Both had solid performances in Week 1, but they were against cupcake opponents. So this is a first true test here. Georgia, I know a lot of people have criticized me for the way I've talked about them and picked them over the past year or two, but they're number 3 for a reason. They're a very solid football team. They've got a solid defense. Had a shutout in Week 1. South Carolina letting up, I believe, 14 points or somewhere around there to Coastal Carolina. But this is a game that, despite having a solid defense for Georgia, I could really see being a high-scoring game because South Carolina is going to very dominant offense. You got Jake Bentley at quarterback. You got Deebo Samuel back from his injury at wide receiver, who wasn't even the leading wide receiver last week, but should play a huge role against the Bulldogs this coming week. And then Georgia, their offense led by Jake Fromm and DeAndre Swift at running back put up 45 points last week. So despite all that, I think this is going to be a high-scoring game. I'm sticking with the Gamecocks to get a huge upset. But in the end, I do believe Georgia will end up winning the SEC East. South Carolina will slip up along the way. If Georgia doesn't lose here, I think they'll lose somewhere. But I think it's going to be here against South Carolina. I don't see anybody else on their schedule that I see them potentially losing to. And then you got number 2 Clemson at Texas A&M. This is, like I said, probably the second biggest game of the week in my opinion, even though game day is going to this game. This is intriguing. You know, Jimbo Fisher escapes the ACC, goes over to the SEC, and he still has to play Clemson, which is fairly ironic. So this time they get to host it in College Station, though. You know it's going to be rocking. It's going to be a great environment. But how's this Clemson team, especially at the quarterback position, going to play? Because Texas A&M looked impressive in their first game. I know it was against Northwestern State, but it was a new look. They had a lot of running, a lot of using those tight ends, something they didn't use with Kevin Sumlin. So Jimbo Fisher has come in and kind of transformed this offense. So will Clemson, and really the defense too, will Clemson be able to use Kelly Bryant and Trevor Lawrence? Will they start one and not the other? Will they play both? Something that Dabo Swinney and his staff are going to have to decide on and to see kind of how they're going to do going up against a fairly underrated, in my opinion, Texas A&M team. I'm sticking with Clemson to get the win here. But I would not be surprised to see this game be a lot closer than some expect. I think Texas A&M is going to be hungry. Jimbo Fisher has played against Clemson before for many years, so he kind of knows what to expect, kind of knows their style. So I would not, especially with it being at home, would not be surprised to see A&M give Clemson a very, very close fight. And then you've got number 13, Penn State at Pittsburgh. And this game important because if you remember 2 years ago, we didn't know it at the time, but Pittsburgh beat Penn State, and that pretty much prevented the Nittany Lions from getting into the college football playoff. I think that was the first loss for Penn State 2 years ago. I think they only lost one more time after that and just barely missed out on the college football playoff and just barely missed out on winning the Rose Bowl as well. Pittsburgh, a decent performance in their season over against Albany. Penn State just barely beating Appalachian State. That game happened to go to overtime, and they won that game with a game-winning interception. So a very underperformance, a very weak performance, I thought, by Penn State there, and you really did start to see a little bit of the loss of Saquon Barkley. I know the offense still looked fairly well. Trace McSorley, one of the better quarterbacks, I think, in the Big Ten. But how are they going to respond at a Pittsburgh team that should be improved from last year, finally has a solid quarterback in Kenny Pickett, looked fairly solid in Week 1. This is going to be a potential trap game for Penn State, especially if they haven't woken up after the Appalachian State game from last week. So, and you know Pittsburgh, after watching that game, thinks, hey, we can beat these guys. I think James Franklin, though, in the end is going to have his team ready to go. I think they do go on the road and beat Pittsburgh. But once again, like Clemson, A&M would not be surprised to see this game be closer than some expect. And then closing out the week, or closing out the biggest games of the week, you got number 17 USC and number 10 Stanford. Now here's an interesting stat that you've probably seen all over the place, but I want to reiterate. Bryce Love, who many had as a major Heisman contender, still has the chance to do that, especially if he has a big game against USC. Last week against San Diego State, which Stanford won by 21, had 18 carries for just 29 yards and no scores. And that's a bit of a problem. If USC can bottle up Bryce Love like San Diego State did, Stanford's going to have a tough time. Now, KJ Costello, I think, is one of the more underrated quarterbacks in the Pac-12. JJ Arcega-Whiteside has 6 receptions for 226 yards and 3 touchdowns last week against San Diego State. So their passing game is more than capable of making up for lost time, lost yards that Bryce Love can't get if the offensive line can help them out. The passing game will definitely be able to take over. And how will this USC team be able to respond with a true freshman quarterback in JT Daniels going on the road to a solid Stanford team that many consider to be the biggest threat to Washington, and Washington just losing to Auburn? So really, if you want to see a Pac-12 representative try to get into the college football playoff, your best bet might be Stanford now to try to run the table, because Washington already has one loss and might lose at least one other time down the road. So this is a huge Pac-12 matchup. Obviously, USC, not a team that I'm super high on this season. I don't expect a whole lot out of them. I do not see them going on the road and defeating Stanford here. They didn't have a super impressive performance as well. You would let UNLV hang around them for a little too long, I thought, winning that game by 22. But JT Daniels had a solid start there, and I'm curious to see how he goes up against the Stanford defense, who only allowed 10 points last year, but did allow a lot of yards on the ground. So this is an intriguing Pac-12 matchup. This game, in my opinion, is always too early in the season, because this game can usually decide a lot in the Pac-12 race. And like I said, these two teams usually meet up, or have met up in the past, in the Pac-12 championship game. So obviously a lot of bad blood there. Should be a really big fun one, but I'm giving the edge to Stanford there. So our picks: Mississippi State, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Clemson, Penn State, and Stanford in our 6 big games of the week. None of these predictions have changed from the ones that we did in the summer, and you probably won't see any prediction changes probably until about midway through the season, unless something drastic happens before then. So week 2 is once again shaping up to be a very exciting one. Our 6 big games, but do not forget the 5 games that we listed before this that you should definitely keep an eye on, because they could be sneaky good and could see a couple potential upset. So we're looking forward to it. Week 2 starts tonight with SMU at TCU and carries on through Saturday. So get ready, get hyped. College football is back in full force. It's going to be here for a while. So as always, please go check us out on Twitter at Gridiron Expert for potential spread picks and some behind the scenes and extra analysis. I tweet a lot during the games live, so make sure you go check us out there. On Instagram at The Gridiron Expert, and I'm going to start putting the links in the description below, so always go be checking those out. And always here on YouTube, please continue to like, comment, and subscribe, and we will see you next time on The Gridiron Expert.